I was 27 when I opened a cardboard box in my small apartment and touched the charred blue fabric that had once been my prom dress, the one I had bought at 17 after months of stacking books at the local store, every dollar hidden under my mattress, like treasure, the one I dreamed would let me feel beautiful for just one night. But what I pulled from that box were blackened scraps, stiff with ash. Reminders of the night my own parents dragged me into the backyard, tore the dress from my hands, doused it with gasoline, and lit it on fire while neighbors leaned over fences to watch, and my father Robert laughed like he had won my mother Linda's face, blank with cold authority, and my sister Melissa, their perfect daughter, smiled before spitting out the words that would scar me longer than flames ever could. "You deserved it." And then the crowd of onlookers laughed awkwardly. Some even shook their heads, but no one moved to stop it. No one defended me. I remember clutching the empty hanger until my knuckles turned white, certain for a second that they might throw me into the fire, too. The smoke stung my throat. My tears refused to fall. My body locked in silence. Humiliation pouring over me hotter than the blaze itself that night was supposed to be my beginning. But it became the proof that in my family, I was nothing more than a target 10 years later. The smell of burnt silk still drifts into my sleep. 10 years later, I wake hearing Melissa's voice repeating those 3 words, 10 years later. I still taste the ash of that betrayal. But what my family never understood is that humiliation does not vanish. It hardens, it sharpens, it waits, and the fire they thought would end me became the spark that kept me alive because they believed they had erased me with smoke and laughter, but they were wrong. 10 years later, I finally had the chance to make them regret every cruel second. When I look back now at 27, I can see that the night of the burning dress was not a sudden storm, but the inevitable peak of years spent in a house where love meant control and kindness meant silence. My family, the Dawsons of a quiet town in Ohio, appeared ordinary from the outside. The kind of people who smiled at church-baked pies for community fairs and kept their lawn trimmed to perfection, but behind the white fence was a world where my father Robert's voice ruled like a gavel, where my mother Linda's eyes judged every breath, and where my older sister Melissa lived as the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the second daughter, quiet or bookish, never quite shining in the way Melissa did, and because of that, I became the target of my parents' constant criticism. Robert was a man who carried his authority like a weapon. He worked at the factory, came home each evening with the smell of grease and sweat on his clothes, and sat at the head of the dinner table as though it were a throne. If I answered too softly, he barked at me to speak up. If I spoke too loudly, he snapped that I was disrespectful. If I asked a question about anything beyond chores, he slammed his fist against the table and demanded I be grateful for what I had. Linda was subtler, but no less harsh. She believed in discipline disguised as care-repeating phrases that pierced deeper than any slap. "We only push you because you are weak," she told me when I cried after a punishment. "I am only saving you from becoming foolish," she insisted when she ripped the cover off my journal and read my private thoughts aloud. Gaslighting was her specialty, making me believe my pain was her mercy. Melissa, 2 years older, absorbed every lesson in cruelty and reflected it back at me. She was praised for grades even when they slipped excused for temper tantrums that would have earned me beatings, celebrated for beauty that was always held against my plainer face. She learned early that siding with our parents gave her power, and she wielded that power by mocking me by copying my clothes so hers seemed superior, by reporting any secret I dared share. I cannot remember a time when I felt safe confiding in her. As a child, I did not yet understand the word toxic, but I understood the feeling of dread that came with the sound of my father's boots on the porch. I understood the humiliation of being compared to Melissa, of hearing Linda sigh and whisper to neighbors that she worried about her younger daughter, who did not seem to have what it takes. I grew up learning to shrink myself. At school, teachers noticed I was quiet, but good at reading, and I lived inside books because they were the only places where people like me were valued. Stories became my escape. Novels tucked under my pillow became my secret rebellion. Every page I turned told me a world existed outside Dawson Street, even if I could not yet reach it. Still, there were moments when I almost believed things could be normal. Family photos taken on holidays show us smiling Robert's heavy hand on Linda's shoulder, Melissa in the middle with her gleaming hair, and me at the side holding my breath trying to fit into the frame. People who saw us from a distance might have thought we were close, but they did not see what happened when the camera was put away. They did not see Robert shouting because the turkey was too dry, Linda criticizing the way I set the table, Melissa whispering that I should stop trying so hard to be noticed. Those small humiliations accumulated like invisible scars. By the time I reached my teenage years, I carried them daily invisible weights pressing down on my spine. When I was 15, I tried to save money from babysitting to buy a pair of sneakers I loved. Robert found the envelope hidden in my drawer and demanded to know where it came from. When I explained, he said I was sneaky and untrustworthy, then used the money to pay for a tool he wanted. Linda told me it was for my own good, that girls should not be obsessed with things like shoes. Melissa laughed and paraded her new sneakers, a gift from them, right in front of me. It was like that with everything. Any step I tried to take toward independence was blocked, belittled, or stolen. By the time I was 16, the pattern was clear. Melissa was the daughter they wanted. I was the daughter they tolerated. Robert told me once during an argument that if he had to choose between us, he would choose her every time because she had potential. Linda nodded in agreement. I carried those words like stones in my chest. This was the environment that shaped me, a house where affection was rationed, where every attempt at self-expression was punished, and where my place was at the bottom of the hierarchy. That was why prom meant so much to me. It was not just a dance, it was a chance to appear in public as someone who mattered, someone who could shine without asking permission. When I looked at that blue dress on the hanger for the first time, I saw not fabric, but freedom. I saw proof that I could build something for myself outside of their control. But in the Dawson household, freedom was dangerous, and they would do everything possible to burn it away. At 17, I thought I had finally found a way to prove that I could exist outside the shadow of Melissa and the suffocating grip of Robert and Linda. I had been working at the small bookstore downtown since the beginning of junior year, shelving paperbacks, sweeping floors, smiling politely at customers who barely noticed me. But each week, I placed a portion of my pay into a glass jar hidden under my mattress. That jar became my secret treasure, my proof that I could make something happen for myself. While Melissa flaunted credit cards given by our parents, I stacked crumpled bills and coins, dreaming of the moment I would walk into the dress shop and buy a gown with my own money. Prom was not just a dance, it was my one chance to walk into a room and feel equal, maybe even radiant for once in my life. When I finally held the dress, a deep ocean blue with delicate beading at the waist, I nearly cried in the fitting room mirror. The fabric shimmered as though it knew how badly I needed this victory. Melissa reacted first when she saw it hanging in my closet. She leaned against the door frame, smirking, and said, "You will look ridiculous. That color makes you look pale. You think you can stand next to me at prom and not embarrass yourself." I told her it was mine, that I had earned it, but she laughed and told our mother, who wasted no time reminding me that the dress was inappropriate too, flashy, too desperate. Robert overheard and barked from his chair. No boy respects a girl who parades around in sequins. Their words hit like blows, stripping away the pride I had felt. I held on to the thought that this time was different because it was my money, my choice. But in that house, even independence was treated as rebellion. The tension grew in the weeks leading up to prom. Each evening at dinner, Robert found a new reason to criticize me. He mocked the way I sat, the way I spoke, even the way I chewed. Linda added her subtle poison, telling me I should reconsider going, that maybe staying home would save me from embarrassment. Melissa grew crueler, whispering that no boy would ever invite me, that my hair looked awful, that the dress made me look like I was playing pretend. One night, I dared to snap back, telling her to shut up. Robert's hand came down across my cheek so fast my ears rang. My face burned, my eyes watered, and when I looked up, Melissa was holding her phone recording, giggling as if my pain was the best entertainment she had ever captured. That was the moment I realized humiliation in my family was not an accident, but a tradition. Even at school, I carried the weight of their contempt. Teachers asked about prom, friends whispered about dates, and I pretended to be excited while knowing that every night at home was another battle. I tried not to let their cruelty show on my face, but sometimes when a teacher complimented me, Melissa's mocking voice would echo in my ears, and I would shrink, convinced I did not deserve even small praise. The dress became my shield. I would unzip the garment bag and run my hands over the smooth fabric, reminding myself that I had earned it, that for one night I would belong. But my family never let me forget my place. The week before prom, Robert told me flat out that he would not allow me to attend if I did not obey his rules. Linda confiscated my makeup, saying it was too grown up for me. Melissa paraded her own gown, a gift from them, across the living room, twirling so that sequins sparkled under the lights, mocking my silence. I clenched my fists and swallowed my anger because I believed if I could just endure until that night, I would finally step into a world where their voices could not reach me. The days crawled by, each insult sharper than the last. Robert accused me of thinking I was better than the family because I worked. Linda whispered that I would embarrass them all if I showed up in that gown. Melissa sneered every time she passed my room. Yet the more they tried to crush me, the tighter I clung to that dream. It was not just about the dance anymore. It was about proving that I could survive them, that their power had limits. Still deep down, I sensed something dark was coming. Robert's temper grew shorter, Linda's lectures longer, Melissa's taunts meaner. When I tried on the dress one final time in front of the mirror, I told myself they cannot take this from me. I believed it with all the fragile faith of a 17-year-old who had never been allowed to hope. I could not have known then that they were already planning the spectacle that would shatter me in front of everyone who mattered. The night of prom should have been the moment everything changed for me, the night I walked into the gymnasium with music blasting and lights flashing and felt like someone worth noticing, but instead it became the moment my family decided to show me exactly how powerless they believed I was. I remember standing in my bedroom, carefully zipping the gown up my back, smoothing the fabric over my hips, and staring at my reflection as though I might finally recognize the girl in the mirror. For the first time in months, I saw myself as beautiful, and for a fleeting second, I believed the pain of the past years could be set aside, that I could arrive at the dance and be just another teenager excited about one perfect night. But when I stepped into the hallway carrying my small purse, Robert's voice boomed from the living room. "Get in here!" His tone made my stomach twist. Linda sat with her arms crossed, her eyes sharp, while Melissa lounged on the couch in her glittering gown. The television was off, the silence thick. Robert ordered me to bring the dress. I froze, refusing, and Melissa leapt up and yanked at the fabric until I stumbled. Within seconds, Robert's hand was gripping my arm so hard I knew it would bruise. He dragged me outside to the backyard, Linda following with a box of matches, Melissa grinning like a spectator at a circus. The spring air was cool, but my skin burned with shame as Robert shoved me toward the grass. He ripped the dress from my body so quickly the zipper snapped and I was left shivering in my slip, clutching my purse as if it could shield me. He flung the dress onto the ground, doused it with gasoline from a red can, and looked at me with disgust. "No daughter of mine will parade around like a cheap fool!" He shouted, his words echoing over the fences. Linda struck a match with a steady hand and dropped it, her face unreadable as flames roared to life. I stood paralyzed as the blue fabric curled black, the sequins bursting with tiny sparks before collapsing into ash. The smell of burning silk filled my throat, choking me, making my eyes water. Melissa's laughter cut through the crackling fire, sharp and gleeful. She leaned close and whispered, "You deserved it," then stepped back to watch my heart shatter. Over the fence, a neighbor peeked, another crossed the street pretending to walk a dog. Both saw but did nothing. The humiliation was not private, it was public. A performance staged by the people who should have loved me most. I wanted to scream, to snatch the dress back, to run, but my body betrayed me, locked in place by terror and disbelief. The hanger I had carried dangled from my hand empty, and for a moment I imagined they might toss me into the fire too. Robert laughed. Linda adjusted her cardigan. Melissa clapped as though it were the finale of a show. My chest ached with a pain deeper than any bruise. A pain that told me I was invisible, disposable, and utterly alone. The flames died slowly, leaving nothing but blackened scraps and smoke drifting into the night sky. I remember the sound of the neighbor's gate closing, the hush of wind, the triumphant smirk on Melissa's face. Robert told me to get inside and stop crying like a child, though I had not shed a tear. Linda said I should be grateful they saved me from humiliating myself. I walked back into the house, numb my skin, cold, my heart hollow. Upstairs in my room, I curled into bed, still wearing the slip, staring at the ceiling until dawn. I did not go to prom. While my classmates danced and posed for photos, I lay in silence, breathing in the phantom smell of smoke, listening to Melissa return home hours later, still laughing with friends, her heels clicking down the hallway like hammer blows. That night was supposed to be the start of adulthood, but instead it was the confirmation that in my family I was nothing more than a target. The memory seared itself into my bones, and even 10 years later at 27, I can close my eyes and see the fire, hear Melissa's whisper, feel the shame that clung to my skin like soot. They thought they had destroyed my spirit with that match, but what they did instead was plant the seed of resistance that would grow quietly inside me, waiting for the moment it could finally break free. 10 years passed between the night of the fire and the day I learned that everything I thought I knew about my life had been built on lies. At 27, I was living in a small apartment above a laundromat, working long hours at a library circulation desk, piecing together enough money to pay rent and keep the lights on. My family rarely called unless they wanted something, and I rarely answered because every conversation with them felt like reopening an old wound. Still, the memory of prom lingered like smoke I could never scrub away. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the night coughing, certain I smelled gasoline, certain I heard Melissa's mocking whisper. I thought my life would always be defined by survival, by keeping my head down and existing quietly outside the shadow of their cruelty. Then a letter arrived summoning me to a downtown law office with a name I had never heard before Blackwood and Harlan. I almost ignored it, convinced it was junk mail, but something about the heavy envelope and embossed lettering made me hesitate. When I walked into the office a week later, the air smelled of leather and old books. A tall man with graying hair introduced himself as Mr. Harlan, an attorney who had represented my grandmother years earlier. He motioned for me to sit, then opened a thick file with my name on the front. Emma Dawson, he said your grandmother left instructions for me to contact you when you reached 21, but attempts to reach you were intercepted. Only recently did we confirm your address. I frowned, confused, and told him I had never received anything. He nodded gravely and explained that my grandmother had left behind not only money, but a trust designed to protect me from the very people who had tried to erase me. The words washed over me like a tide I could not stop. According to the will, when my grandmother passed shortly before my 17th birthday, she left her estate specifically to me. There was a clause that delayed full access until I was older, but she had written in unmistakable handwriting that if I ever faced humiliation or abuse from my family, her lawyers were to intervene. I stared at him in disbelief. Abuse was too polite a word for what I had endured, yet I had never imagined anyone outside those walls knew or cared. He continued by sliding a folder across the desk. Inside was a DVD and printed stills from a video I instantly recognized. The backyard. The flames, my father's face twisted with anger. Linda striking the match. Melissa smirking as she mouthed the words, "You deserved it." My knees shook so hard I gripped the arms of the chair. "Who filmed this?" I asked, my voice thin. "A neighbor," Harlan replied. Someone who had turned it over years ago as evidence. It had been locked in the firm's files, waiting until the time came to use it. I wanted to laugh and cry at once. For years, I thought no one had seen. No one had cared. Yet proof existed in crisp detail, undeniable. Harlan told me the trust was substantial enough to change my circumstances entirely. My grandmother had foreseen that my parents might mistreat me and had written protections into the legal documents. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, "She knew. She always knew." He nodded and said she had insisted that I be safeguarded from humiliation, that if ever I felt disrespected in my own home, her lawyers were to act. The fire had been the proof she predicted. I left the office clutching the folder like it contained my future, because in truth, it did. Walking back into the sunlight, I felt as though the ground had shifted beneath me. For 10 years, I had carried shame like a chain, but suddenly, it was my weapon. The same moment that had nearly destroyed me was now the key to my freedom. I could hear Melissa's words in my head. You deserved it, and for the first time I realized how wrong she was. I did not deserve pain. They deserved the reckoning that was coming. That evening, my phone buzzed with a number I had not seen in months. Robert's voice was gruff, already demanding. Emma, what the hell is this? Some lawyer showed up talking nonsense about property and money, claiming you have rights you don't understand. I listened without answering, my chest tight but steady. He barked that I needed to meet them immediately, that I was being manipulated, that this was family business. When he finally paused, I said, 10 years ago, you burned my dress. Now you will watch me take back everything you tried to steal. I hung up before he could respond. For the first time in a decade, I felt something close to power. I looked at the charred scraps still kept in my closet and realized they were no longer symbols of defeat. They were evidence, testimony proof. My grandmother had given me the tools my neighbors had captured the truth, and the law was on my side. The night of the fire had been their triumph, but 10 years later it became my turning point. They believed they had destroyed me with gasoline and laughter. What they had really done was light the fuse that would now blow their entire facade apart. When the first call ended, I knew it would not be the last. My family had never accepted the word no, and now that the balance of power had shifted, they would not stop until they tried to drag me back under their control. 2 days later, Robert, Linda, and Melissa showed up unannounced outside my apartment, pounding on the door so hard the frame rattled. My stomach clenched, but I opened it because I wanted them to see that I was no longer 17, trembling in my slip while they laughed. I was 27, holding evidence and the weight of the law behind me. Robert barged in first, his bulk filling the small living room, his voice already raised. Emma, you are being used, he shouted. Those lawyers are feeding you lies to steal money from this family. Linda followed her tone, icy, saying the documents must be fraudulent, that my grandmother never intended to cut them out. Melissa strolled in, last arms folded, smirking as though none of this mattered, and said with mocking sweetness, You really think you are smarter than us now, don't you? I set the folder of documents on the table and let them see the official seals. Mr. Harlan had already explained every clause, every signature, every protection built for me. Robert's face reddened as he flipped through the pages, his hands shaking, muttering that this was impossible. He slammed his fist against the table, accusing me of betrayal, accusing me of tearing apart our family. Linda chimed in, her words dripping with contempt. Emma, you have always been fragile, always been confused. How can you believe strangers over your own parents? She leaned forward and hissed, You are not capable of handling money. You never were. You will ruin everything. Melissa laughed, tossing her hair, and added, She cannot even pick a dress without embarrassing herself. Now she thinks she can manage an estate. The gaslighting was familiar, the rhythm of their attack well rehearsed, but this time I did not bend. I told them calmly that the will was real, that the video existed, and that the court would recognize both. Robert lunged closer, his finger stabbing the air, calling me ungrateful, saying that every meal I had ever eaten was because of him, that every roof I had slept under belonged to him. I stared into his face and said the words I had never dared say before. That roof was built on my grandmother's money, and that house was never yours. He froze, stunned, then sputtered like an engine that had lost its spark. Linda quickly filled the silence, insisting that the video could not prove abuse, that it had just been discipline, that they were protecting me from ridicule. I asked if humiliating your child in front of neighbors and burning her dress was protection. Her eyes flickered, but she doubled down, insisting that I had misunderstood. Melissa rolled her eyes and muttered, You really should thank us, Emma. We kept you from making a fool of yourself. The fury that had been simmering for a decade finally rose, but instead of screaming, I let my voice grow steadier. I told them I was filing with the court, that I would claim what was mine, and that they could no longer touch me. Robert's face twisted with rage, and he spat that if I went through with this, they would have me declared incompetent. He said he would find doctors to prove I was unstable, that no judge would hand property to a girl who could not even hold her family together. Linda nodded quickly, seizing the tactic, insisting that my history of quietness, my preference for books, my occasional tears, were all signs of mental weakness. They told me they would protect the estate from me, that they would convince everyone I was unfit. For a heartbeat, I felt the old fear return, the same paralysis that had frozen me in front of the fire. But then I remembered Mr. Harlan's promise, remembered the competence evaluation he had already suggested, and I realized their threats were empty if I did not give them power. I stood, picked up the folder, and told them the meeting was over. Robert bellowed, "Don't you walk away from me." I said simply, "I already did 10 years ago, you just never noticed." The silence that followed was heavier than their shouting. They left in a storm of curses, slamming the door so hard the walls shook, but I remained standing, breathing evenly, my hands steady on the folder. That night, Melissa sent me a text dripping with sarcasm. "Enjoy playing the victim," it read, "because when the truth comes out, you will be the one humiliated." I did not reply. For the first time, I understood that their cruelty was no longer a cage, but a mirror reflecting their fear. They knew I had the power to end their charade, and they were scrambling to regain control. I lay awake in bed, not with dread, but with anticipation. They wanted a fight in the dark. I would bring it into the light, and this time they would be the ones left trembling. The morning after their visit, I sat at the small kitchen table of my apartment with the folder spread wide, sunlight cutting across the pages like a spotlight. For the first time in my life, the law stood on my side, not theirs, and I knew I could not waste that chance. Mr. Harlan had already told me the will was airtight, the video undeniable, but I also understood my family's talent for twisting narratives. They would paint me as unstable as a bitter child seeking revenge, as a confused woman incapable of responsibility. I could not simply defend myself, I had to outthink them. I called Mr. Harlan and said I wanted every possible safeguard in place. He agreed, promising to file petitions immediately and to request a competency evaluation under my own terms. By volunteering first, I stripped their weapon from their hands. If they tried to claim I was unfit, the court would see I had already proven otherwise. In the weeks that followed, I became meticulous. Every conversation with them, I documented every cruel text I saved, every voicemail dripping with threats I forwarded to Harlan's office. When Robert left me a message saying, "If you do this, you will regret it," I transcribed it word for word. When Linda called to weep and say I was breaking her heart, then shifted into threats about how I would be disowned, I kept the recording. Melissa, ever smug, sent emails mocking me, promising that she and our parents would crush me. I printed each one, stacking them like bricks in the wall I was building against them. But resistance was not only about evidence, it was also about reclaiming my voice. I reached out to the neighbor who had filmed the prom night fire, a woman named Mrs. Carver, who still lived down the street from my childhood home. She was older now, frail, but her eyes still sharp when she opened the door. When I explained who I was, her gaze softened. "I remember that night," she said quietly. "I always regretted not doing more." I told her she had already done more than she knew by preserving the tape. She agreed to testify if necessary, her signature trembling but strong on the affidavit Mr. Harlan prepared. That moment gave me strength I had not felt since I was a child, a reminder that even in the darkest memories someone had seen the truth. Meanwhile, my family escalated. They hired an attorney of their own, a brash man who sent me a letter filled with accusations claiming I was mentally unstable and manipulated by outsiders. But when Harlan replied with the stack of recording screenshots and the video of the fire, their tone shifted. Still, Robert left another voicemail growling that he would never be thrown out of his own house, that I owed him everything. I listened once, then sent it straight to the evidence pile. I refused to engage with their rage. Instead, I poured my focus into preparation. One evening, as I sat at the library on break, reviewing legal texts Harlan had recommended, I realized how much I had changed. 10 years earlier, I was a girl with no power, silenced and humiliated. Now I was a woman arming herself with knowledge, refusing to let their lies stand. I began journaling again, not the fearful scribbles Linda once mocked, but detailed records of dates, times, and facts. This time, my words were weapons. The first court hearing arrived sooner than I expected. I walked into the courthouse wearing a navy suit I had purchased secondhand, my hair pulled back, my chin lifted. Robert glared from across the aisle. Linda whispered furiously to Melissa, and Melissa smirked as though she already knew the outcome. But when the judge played the video, the room fell silent. The crackle of flames, the sound of Robert shouting Linda striking the match. Melissa whispering, "You deserved it, all of it," filled the chamber. I watched my parents' faces pale, Melissa's smirk falter, and for once I felt the weight lift from my chest. No longer was it my word against theirs. It was the truth staring them in the face. When the judge asked if I had anything to add, I spoke calmly. 10 years ago, I was a child, silenced by fear. Today, I stand as an adult who refuses to be erased. My voice did not shake. For once, I owned the silence that followed. The moment the judge recessed after that first hearing, I knew the tide had turned. My family filed out with stiff shoulders and downcast eyes, but the whispers that followed them down the courthouse steps told the larger story. Neighbors who once admired Robert for his discipline or praised Linda for her composure were now looking at them with open disgust. By the time the ruling was delivered 2 weeks later, the damage to their reputation was irreversible. The court declared the trust valid and placed the estate under my sole control. The house that Robert had always called his the savings, Linda bragged she had managed the legacy Melissa assumed she would inherit. All of it was mine and mine alone. When the news spread through town, people remembered the video. They remembered the cold words, "You deserved it," and they began to see the Dawson family not as upstanding citizens, but as cruel architects of humiliation. Robert tried to salvage his pride by storming into the local diner one morning, insisting loudly that the judge had been biased, that I had manipulated the system. But the other patrons, many of whom had watched me grow up, no longer nodded in agreement. One man told him straight, "We saw the tape, Rob. We heard your voice." Robert left with his face red and his jaw tight. Linda fared no better. She attempted to host her church group as usual, but attendance dwindled until only 2 women showed up, both of them avoiding eye contact. When one finally asked if the stories were true, Linda broke down and wept, but her tears no longer inspired sympathy. They only confirmed what people suspected. Melissa faced her own fall. The university that had offered her a prestigious scholarship rescinded it, citing the scandal and the damage to its reputation. For someone who had built her identity on superiority, the loss was devastating. She called me late one night, her voice trembling with rage. "You ruined my life," she hissed. "Do you feel powerful now?" I answered simply, "I did not ruin your life, Melissa. You did that when you chose cruelty over compassion." She hung up, but not before I heard the sob catch in her throat. The humiliation they had inflicted on me was now mirrored back at them, magnified by public exposure. For Robert, the loss of control was unbearable. He wandered the town like a man stripped of purpose, people whispering behind his back, his authority gone. For Linda, the loss of social standing cut deepest. She could no longer sit in the front pew, basking in admiration. Instead, she sat alone, eyes downcast, while others shifted away. And for Melissa, the reality that she was no longer the golden daughter, but a cautionary tale burned worse than any flame. But the consequences extended beyond reputation. With the court order final, they were given 30 days to vacate the house. The same house where they had sneered at my attempts to decorate, where Robert dictated what colors were acceptable, where Linda rearranged my bookshelves to hide what she deemed silly, was no longer theirs. I drove by one afternoon and saw boxes piled on the porch, Melissa shoving clothes into bags, Robert barking orders that no one obeyed. Neighbors stood at the edge of their lawns, watching silently. The Dawsons, who once projected control, now looked like fugitives from their own kingdom. I did not gloat, though the temptation was there. I stood at the end of the street and watched as the moving truck pulled away, carrying their furniture, their memories, their illusions of ownership. I thought of the night they burned my dress, how they had laughed while my future turned to ash, and I realized this was their fire. Their laughter had become silence, their confidence reduced to fear. When the 30 days ended, I walked through the front door alone. The rooms were empty, the air heavy with the ghosts of arguments and tears. Yet I felt something shift as I stepped across the threshold. For the first time in my life, this space belonged to me, not just on paper, but in truth. I stood in the center of the living room where Robert once barked commands, and Linda issued judgments, and Melissa rolled her eyes, and I whispered to the silence, "It is mine now." The words echoed softly, not with vengeance, but with release. After the house was finally mine, truly mine, I began the slow work of reclaiming not just the space, but myself. For years, I had lived in cramped apartments, never daring to paint walls or hang pictures because they were never permanent. Now, I stood in rooms that had once been prisons and saw blank canvases waiting for me to write my own story. The first thing I did was strip the wallpaper in the dining room, the one Linda had chosen with stiff floral patterns I always hated. As I pulled it down strip by strip, I felt as if I were peeling away her voice from my life. In the kitchen, I opened cabinets Melissa once used to hide my favorite mugs and set them neatly where I could reach them every morning. In the living room, I dragged Robert's heavy chair out to the curb and left it for garbage pickup smiling as a stranger loaded it into a truck carrying away the throne that had symbolized his control. But rebirth was not just about redecorating. It was about reclaiming the future I had been denied. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, choosing subjects I had always been told were too complicated for me. Law, financial planning, psychology. I wanted to understand the systems they had used to keep me dependent. At first, the textbooks were overwhelming, but I studied late into the night, driven by a hunger that had smoldered for 10 years. Slowly, knowledge began to replace fear. I passed my first exams with top marks, and when I hung the graded papers on my refrigerator, I felt more pride than I had ever felt as a teenager. I also began to write again, not the fearful scribbles I once hid from Linda, but essays and journals filled with clarity. I wrote about what it meant to live in a toxic family, about how humiliation becomes invisible chains, about how silence can kill a soul. Some nights the words came out like screams, some nights like whispers, but always they came with truth. And as I wrote, I felt the girl in the prom dress slowly fade into the woman who had survived. One afternoon, I went shopping downtown and saw a dress in the window, a shade of deep blue so similar to the one that had been burned. For a moment, my chest tightened, but then I walked inside and tried it on. It fit perfectly, hugging me in all the right places. I bought it with my own money and wore it to my college orientation, standing tall among younger students. I caught my reflection in the glass doors of the building and almost laughed. 10 years ago, I had been stripped of that color in fire. Now I wore it proudly, no longer a victim, but a survivor dressed in resilience. My rebirth also meant building connections I had once thought impossible. I volunteered at a local shelter for women escaping abusive homes, listening to their stories, sharing my own. They looked at me with recognition, with understanding, and I realized my pain had purpose. I was not just healing myself. I was helping others see that survival was possible. Each time I spoke, I grew stronger. Each time they thanked me, I felt the weight of my past lighten. Of course, the scars remained. Some nights I still woke smelling smoke, still heard Melissa's voice in my dreams. But instead of drowning me, those memories fueled me. They reminded me of how far I had come. I began to plant a garden in the backyard, turning the patch of grass where my dress had been burned into a space of color and life. Roses, tulips, lavender. Each blossom felt like defiance. Each root felt like permanence. Standing there with dirt on my hands, sun on my face, I whispered to myself, "This is mine." The woman who once believed she had no choice now had every choice. The girl who once thought humiliation defined her now defined herself. Rebirth was not a sudden transformation. It was daily work, daily victories, daily decisions to live on my own terms. And for the first time, I looked toward the future not with fear, but with anticipation. The night before the final court order was delivered, I sat on the porch of the house that was now mine, the same porch where I had once stood trembling as a teenager, listening to my parents laugh inside while I cried alone. The air was cool, the garden newly blooming with the flowers I had planted, and for the first time I felt peace in a place that had only ever brought me pain. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, Melissa's name lighting up the screen. I hesitated before answering, already expecting the venom in her voice, but instead of insults, I heard desperation. "Emma," she said, her words rushed. "We do not have anywhere to go. Dad cannot find work. Mom cries all day. I do not know what to do." Her voice cracked in a way I had never heard. She asked if I could let them come back even just for a little while, if I could forgive them because we are still family. For a long moment, I sat in silence staring at the garden where my dress had once turned to ash, and I felt the weight of 10 years pressing down on me. Once I would have begged for their love. Once I would have sacrificed myself to keep peace. But I remembered Robert's hand yanking my arm, Linda's cold eyes as she struck the match, Melissa's whisper, "You deserved it," and I knew forgiveness did not mean returning to chains. I told her quietly, "I will not open my doors to cruelty again." She began to cry, insisting they had changed, that they had learned, but I did not let her words sway me. I told her the truth. You cannot erase the past with apologies spoken only when you have nothing left. She cursed then, the old venom returning, and she hung up. The silence that followed was louder than her sobs. The next morning, the court finalized everything. The deed, the trust, the accounts all placed permanently in my name. I walked out of the courthouse holding the stamped papers, sunlight warm on my face. Reporters had gathered curious about the scandal that had shaken a small town, and one asked if I had anything to say. I looked into the camera, thinking of every person who had ever been silenced by family, every woman who had been told she was weak or irrelevant, and I said, "Sometimes survival is the loudest revenge." The words spread quickly, quoted in the local paper, shared online, and people I had never met sent letters thanking me for speaking. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt slowly. The house filled with my colors, my books, my laughter. The library job felt too small now, so I pursued my classes with new determination, already planning to apply to law school so I could help others fight battles like mine. When neighbors stopped by with gifts of flowers or pies, I accepted with gratitude, no longer hiding from kindness. When Mrs. Carver visited frail but smiling, she touched my hand and said, "You were brave, child." I told her she had been braver by recording the truth. Yet the story did not end neatly. Some nights I still dreamed of fire, still heard Melissa's laughter. Some mornings I woke with anger burning in my chest. Healing was not a straight path. But as I stood in my new garden watching sunlight spill over roses that had once grown from ashes, I realized that the scars would always be there and they would always remind me of what I had survived. And survival was no small thing. I do not know what will happen to my parents or to Melissa. Perhaps they will find a way to rebuild. Perhaps they will remain shadows of what they once pretended to be. But I no longer carry the burden of saving them. My story is not about their downfall. It is about my rising. I look at the house, at the blue dress hanging in my closet. The new one I bought not to replace the old, but to remind me of who I am now, and I know the girl who once stood helpless in the fire is gone. In her place stands a woman who walked through flames and emerged stronger. The ending is not a full stop, but an open door. I do not know exactly where it leads, but for the first time in my life, I am not afraid to walk through it.